For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Mark Needham in the Recreation Resource Management Program, Department of Forest Resources at OSU, and I'd like to acknowledge the co-PI on the project, Dr. Joe Tynan, who's seated over here. The study is jointly funded by HCRI and Division of Aquatic Resources, entitled A Multi-Stakeholder Approach to Carrying Capacity and Management of Nearshore Reefs, or Nearshore Recreation in Hawaii. So just to give you a little bit of background, tourism in Hawaii generates about 7 million annual visitors. That's representative of 66% growth in the last 20 years. Interestingly, 80% of visitors engage in some form of marine recreation, be it diving, snorkeling, swimming, kayaking, etc. And 30% of households in Hawaii also fish for recreation, 9% for subsistence. And reefs generate, following some of the work that's being done through HCRI, reefs generate about $360 million in revenue, value-added revenue annually. Well, the challenge with all this increasing use is how do you manage conditions so the conditions do not deteriorate? Now, recognizing that all recreation and tourism in marine environments does cause some impact, but how do you manage use so it doesn't cause impacts beyond what we would consider acceptable or should be allowed? When we're talking about recreation impacts, we can break these into a number of categories. Resource impacts, which we've heard a lot of today, not necessarily from recreation, but just resource impacts such as coral trampling, mortality, pollution, etc. Managerial impacts related to impacts on facilities and services from increasing recreational use, and also social impacts, conflict among different recreation user groups, within recreation user groups, crowding issues, etc., which this project will largely focus on. An important thing to be aware of is that public evaluations of conditions and management actions is vitally important. Without knowing what constituents agree with, disagree with, their attitudes, beliefs, often management actions are ineffective without support. So our study really addresses the need for estimating crowding and capacity issues, conflict among recreation and between recreation groups, and acceptance of management actions. And I'm going to give a little bit of background as to sort of the paradigm that I'm coming from as a social scientist, so everyone's on the same wavelength. When we talk about recreation carrying capacity, as recreation literature is about 20 years ahead of the tourism literature in this issue of carrying capacity, but the tourism literature and the recreation literature borrow carrying capacity from range agriculture, which basically said how many cows can you put on a plot of land until they eat themselves out of house and home. So that really gets at the environmental issues, the level at which biophysical impacts, biophysical conditions decline as a result of use. What is the threshold? However, when you're talking recreation and tourism, there's a number of other types of carrying capacity that must be considered. Social, the point at which experiences and social conditions like crowding, conflict, etc. decline. Facility, the need and level of facilities that are needed to accommodate use. And there's also physical carrying capacity, which is basically the size of the site, but no one really studies that all that much. The problem that we need to recognize is there's no single one magic number across all these different types of carrying capacity. In fact, when you think of social carrying capacity, there's a number of indicators within that, crowding, conflict, and there might be different numbers for different activity groups. So trying to find this single number to represent a carrying capacity in our field is sort of being alluded to as the quest for the Holy Grail. Carrying capacity consists of two different components. The first is descriptive, how much change occurs. So research has shown here that if you have 200,000 visitors on a coral reef, that equates to approximately 100% coral mortality. The evaluative component, however, recognizes that some impact is inevitable. But the question is how much impact is acceptable or should be allowed. So if you have 100,000 visitors, what is the percent coral mortality? And if it's, say, 50%, is that acceptable or unacceptable? It might be acceptable to you, it might not be acceptable to me. It might have differences among stakeholders, differences among managers as to what's acceptable or unacceptable. So it really boils down to a management decision informed largely by social science. If there's agreement among a lot of stakeholders, if there's agreement among biologists about how much use is too much, it's a relatively simple decision. If there's a lot of disagreement among groups, it's a much more difficult decision. So impacts tend to be unacceptable when we make judgments about them. They tend to be acceptable when we make judgments about them. So carrying capacity frameworks, there's a number of them. Limits of acceptable change, LAC, visitor experience and resource protection, which is being used largely to manage use in the national parks today. It really switches gears away from recreation carrying capacity to a management by objectives decision making. So what are the objectives for which we're trying to manage a park? Are we trying to manage a park for solitude type experiences, or are we trying to manage it for a sacrifice area where we're trying to concentrate use so that people don't destroy other areas? So it really is, what are the objectives for the area, and then measuring specific indicators that target those objectives. It's impossible to measure absolutely everything related to recreation, biological impacts, social impacts. So it's picking very key indicators that tap into those objectives. So important indicators for carrying capacity, social carrying capacity might be crowding. For resource issues, it might be litter. And all indicators are measurable variables that are related to objectives and that are sensitive to use and amenable to management. We measure indicators to try and understand or get a quantitative estimate on what standards are for those indicators. Standards really are thresholds at which those indicator conditions become unacceptable. So it might be, an indicator might be crowding, a standard might be people should encounter no more than 10 people per day, something along those lines. It's conditions that should be achieved and also not exceeded, and we can monitor conditions to make sure those things are not exceeded. It really is a tool for understanding the importance of indicators, if impacts are unacceptable or acceptable, and also to the degree of consensus, if any, exists among stakeholders. And I'm going to show an empirical example of this a little later, which will make some sense out of it. Another topic we're investigating is recreation conflict. Recreation conflict is a management nightmare. It causes a number of problems: displacement of users, dissatisfaction among users, can cause crime. It's also very costly to manage. There's a number of different types of conflict. There's one-way conflict. So snorkelers don't like motorboaters, something like that. They're having problems with motorboaters. Two-way conflict is that motorboaters are also having a problem with snorkelers. So one-way is one group versus another, but not reciprocal. Two-way is both groups don't like each other. There's also in-group conflict. Snorkelers in conflict with other snorkelers, and out-group snorkelers in conflict with another activity group, for example. There's also this thing called interpersonal and social values conflict, which is very important for managers, and it's easier to sort of get a sense of this from this thing. If you observe an issue like people cutting you off or swearing at you or trampling on coral, something like that, if you observe it and you consider it a problem, that's interpersonal conflict. In other words, two groups clashing, so to speak. If you do not observe it, yet you still consider it to be a problem, that's a difference in social values. We see a lot of that between hunters and wildlife viewers in a similar area that might never see each other because they're divided by, like, you know, a valley or something like that, but it's the same wilderness area. Wildlife viewers really have a problem with simply knowing that hunting goes on in the area, even though they may never hear a shot being fired or see an animal being shot, etc. It's important for managers to understand the different types and the magnitude of conflict. For example, if there's interpersonal conflict where two groups are clashing, you can zone these groups apart so they don't run into each other. Social values conflict, you can also use visitor education, education of users, so that they understand why different activity groups are permitted in an area and why they're not. Recreation management, there's really sort of two different approaches to recreation management. One is to use direct strategies where they act directly on visitors. Visitors don't have a choice in the matter as to what they can do. It's very regulatory, a lot of control, and also quite costly for management, such as zoning areas, implementing fees, quota systems, permits, prohibit use, or you just flat close an area. Indirect strategies are a little more subtle, where you're trying to influence behavior. They're often preferred more by users, and they actually can be more effective than direct strategies. They often require less cost and less regulation. Things like interpretation and education, site hardening, like developing specific trails so that people don't go all over the place, those kind of things. However, acceptance of different management actions depends on a number of conditions. And that really are social, biophysical, and management conditions. So if the area looks like a bomb's going off, visitors might actually be more supportive of strict, direct actions to regulate use. But if everything seems to be going okay, there's not that much impact, there's not much crowding, there's not much conflict, maybe some indirect strategies might be more acceptable.